Good afternoon, everybody, and I just want to thank all of you for coming today. It's a somber day, but it's also celebratory. It's largely celebratory. And before I introduce our first eulogist speaker, I just want to read you very briefly a letter, email letter that arrived on my father's email that my wife checked this morning, and I think the timing was perfect. And it is as follows. Stanley, I just read, we took it for granted in the Yale Alumni Magazine. January 6th was my third day on the job representing the beautiful and beautifully diverse 3rd Congressional District of New Mexico. I'm madly in love with our fragile democracy and the possibility it offers for the diverse, beloved communities I represent. I was angry more than scared that day, and now recognize that we must be also scared. And I think that meant to be we must be all scared. Yet still I persist in the belief that we will do the work to get to the other side. Our descendants will note that we were good ancestors to have left them with the world's first truly inclusive democracy. Thank you for writing such a letter. I usually don't read the letters outside of my class, and I'm grateful that I allowed my eyes to wander over the class of 45W. In gratitude, Teresa Leaker Fernandez, Yale class, 1982. Now, we're going to have many speakers from different backgrounds, family, friends, and we're going to start with Stanley's first grandchild, Evan Levy. And believe it or not, he is past the 40-year mark a year ago. And I think he's pretty grateful that he had a grandfather around for that long. So ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Evan Levy.
Hi. I don't know a lot of people here. And I don't have a very downer speech eulogy to talk about today, to be honest. None of us grandkids had a very typical relationship with our grandfather, or kind of that typical grandfatherly relationship. I remember riding my bike with him on 5th Avenue in the city, and he wasn't talking to me about, how fast I could go or anything. He said, "Do you know what shape the stones on the ground are?" And when I didn't, I got explained why a hexagon was a hexagon and so on. As Pop got older, he softened. He certainly did. He always had strong opinions, for sure. But as he aged, I found he was willing to hear more of what I thought. And we loved talking about it. I have come to realize that Pop and I had a few similarities. We were both very vain. We loved golf, and we respected a good tan. He made sure to outlive Barbara Walters, and was probably pretty bummed that the Pope tried to overshadow him at the end of the year. I don't have, as I said, too many Pop stories that I think will make this room well up. But I have some special memories. Pop told one of my friends once when we were on our way to visit him at his Yale class that actually I got to visit with a few of my friends. He explained that when he traveled, he always wore a cashmere sweater. It was a good look. To this day, that friend still wears a cashmere sweater on every trip. Pop taught me, indirectly, to listen to anyone. You can always get something from someone when you listen to them. And how much news matters as long as you understand the source of the news, but to take it all in. I will forever remember a building probably not too far from here of my kids running down the hall with their great-grandfather while he legitimately was trying to win the race and explaining, don't yell too loud, you might wake people up. I had a great-grandparent for 13 years of my life, and it was very special. And I'm very lucky that Marissa and I our kids had a great-grandparent for 5 and 7 years of their lives. I didn't know all these photos were going to be here. My image of Pop Pop is actually a very simple one that I will always remember, and how I will always think of him in my head. At my mom's 60th birthday party in the city, my wife and I were dating at the time, and Pop Pop, wearing his gray slacks, blue blazer, tied to the very top, of course, walks up to Marissa, who was wearing an emerald dress, not very long, high heels, and he says, "May I have this dance?" And he spins her around the dance floor, making sure that all eyes were on him as they were dancing around at my mom's 60th birthday. And there's a fantastic picture of it, but that's how I will always remember him. And I think how he would like to be remembered, to be honest.
I neglected to mention at the outset here that my name is Steve Flink. I'm Stanley's son. That was rather sloppy, but let me get that out of the way. I usually do better work than this, so from here on in, I will. But our next speaker, I know quite well. He's another of Stanley's grandson. He's my son, Jonathan. They had a terrific relationship. Jonathan Flink is going to tell you all about it.
I would like to share a few of my most lasting memories about my grandfather, whom I always called Papa. We enjoyed many different experiences together that will always stay in my mind, both when I was a kid and since I became an adult. It was hard for me to narrow down the list, but here are just a few that are meaningful to me. Papa and I had an ongoing backgammon rivalry that started when I was young and continued as I got older. We would play each game for just a penny. Papa certainly was a skilled backgammon player. He knew the rules and strategy inside and out, but nothing could prepare him for games that he played against me. The game would start with Papa, and Papa would be very strategic immediately, analyzing each possibility before making his move. On the other hand, I would be rolling with one hand, eating a snack with the other, and watching a TV show at the same time while rolling doubles over and over again. My way of playing backgammon completely baffled him. As I would keep rolling these doubles, he would shake his head and laugh. I hardly seemed to be paying attention to the game at all, but that did not stop me from beating him more than he would have liked. Papa would call my dad over from the other side of the room and express his disbelief after losing a game to me, and all three of us would laugh. I can still see the puzzled expression on his face. Through the years, Nana and Papa would invite me over for sleepovers many times. Every sleepover was a blast. Sometimes we would go to the Eli Whitney Museum and Papa would educate me about every exhibit. On other occasions, we would make Fruit Loop pancakes and Papa would just shake his head about how ridiculous this was, but still went along with it. One thing was consistent about sleepovers. We would take walks to Lookout Point up the hill from his house on Deepwood Drive in Hampton. There was a pathway that led to a bench with a nice view overlooking New Haven. While on these walks, Papa would have conversation topics in mind, and one big subject we talked about more than once was the importance of good manners. As I got older, the topics changed to current events and finally the value of a good education. I felt that every time we got together, I was going to learn something from Papa. Papa and I had many adventures in Florida. He took me to see my first R-rated movie when I was 13. Even today, it is still my favorite movie. On that same trip, we went on a boat ride up the Indian River in Melbourne, Florida. He rented fishing gear and bait for me. And then Papa, my father, and I set off down the river. He was the captain, I was the navigator, and my father was the sunbather. Papa always had amazing knowledge of his surroundings, so he was explaining to me on that boat ride the details about the plants and animals. I started fishing and soon got a bite, so I started reeling it in. As the fish got closer, an alligator came up and took the fish off my hook. Pop just laughed about the alligator and continued telling me about the importance of the mangrove trees. We saw manatees, dolphins, and more alligators along the way as I kept fishing, but I had no luck after the first boat. Eventually, Pop steered the boat up onto a sandbar. At that point, Pop and my father promptly told me to get out of the boat and push it, despite the fact that we had seen those alligators close by. Somehow, I managed to push us free from the sandbar and we continued on our trip. This story reminds me that Pop always went above and beyond himself to make sure that every visit and encounter with him was memorable. He wanted to make sure that I enjoyed my time with him doing the things that he loved, like educating and giving tours, but he made sure to do things that I enjoyed too, including fishing and being on the water. In closing, I want to say that Pop was an amazing grandfather. He never wanted to waste time when we were around each other and always had my best interest at heart. I loved my grandfather very much and will miss him.
Now we shift away from the family to friends and people who were, I would say, essential figures in Stanley's life. And the first of these individuals is named Sam Chauncey. On your program, we list him as Henry Chauncey, but better known as Sam to his friends. He's a Yale graduate, and he was secretary of the university when my father came to work at Yale in 1973. They worked closely together. They became great friends. Sam kept in touch with Dad and Joy after they moved to Evergreen Woods. He's retired and lives in New Haven. Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Chauncey.
Thank you, Steve, very much. Stanley Flink was an extraordinary man whose long life was filled with interesting work, carried on creatively and intelligently. He came into my life in 1973 when Yale President Kingman Brewster appointed him to the new position of Director of Alumni Communications and Public Information. It was a time when the field of communications was new to Yale and to most major universities. Previously, graduates had just accepted what the university did, and the university didn't much care what the greater world thought about it. In the years after Stanley came to Yale, in addition to that job, he also pinch hit as editor of the Yale Alumni magazine. And while another editor was being sought, and he brought to that old magazine new graphics and new life, which pleased the alumni no end. His class notes for the class of 1945W were thought by all of us to be the best ever written, with humor and inventiveness. But the bare facts do not tell the story of Stanley and Yale. Kingman had asked me to interview Stanley before his appointment, and at a lunch we had at Morey's, I remember being immediately taken by his lively personality and conversation. I saw that he had real skills in what we needed in communications. But you know, I had a worry. Here was a sophisticated journalist entering the then staid academy. How would it go? He arrived at Yale, and in his own unique way, he jumped into the world of this university. A few faculty members were perplexed, but many found him to be an industrious and interesting man, and he taught so much about what faculty and administrators needed to know about the modern world. He had a capacity to get along with everybody. What happened was very interesting. Stanley opened up to all of us, and particularly to the faculty, teaching us about this new world of communications and how it could help Yale and the faculty pursue their goals. At the same time, Stanley was able to adapt his considerable intelligence to the academic world, and he began to learn how faculty members thought and went about their work. This was a two-way educational process in which ultimately both parties benefited. Stanley changed and Yale changed. Stanley changed in that he became a lot less interested in communications and public relations, and he moved into a strong interest in the pursuit of ideas and passing those on through teaching. Yale changed in that it came to realize it could no longer just pursue its goals in the ivory tower, and it had to learn how to explain what it was doing, both to its graduates and the world at large. After Stanley left Yale, he and Joy remained very much a part of New Haven and the Yale communities. I immediately saw this new Stanley Flink follow his growing intellectual interest in teaching and writing. He had a very successful undergraduate seminar in writing, and he continued to write himself. His little book, produced about free speech, is a gem, and it ought to be read by every college student in the world. He mastered the art of teaching, and that continued here at Evergreen Woods, I gather, with great success. But in addition to all that, there are two things that meant the most to me about Stanley, and I want to mention them to you. The first is Joy. She is a woman of extraordinary common sense and judgment. She was his compatriot and his companion, and he never could have accomplished as much as he did without her. The second is that I have never known a person who was as kind as was Stanley Flink. Behind and underneath that ebullient personality, he deeply cared about human beings. I remember him quietly, without fanfare, buying a warm coat for a poor student. I remember him bringing my secretary flowers when her father died. Stanley's life was well lived. It was a life of the mind, and it was wrapped in kindness. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I think you really got to the heart of it in that speech. All in 5 minutes. It's remarkable. But our next speaker had a remarkable relationship with my father in recent years in the academic world, because Bruce Fraser is a longtime friend of my father's, and they collaborated on several projects. He's a professor of philosophy at Indian River State College in Florida, where he also serves as the director of the Institute for Academic Excellence. He's the founder and managing partner of New Common Ground, which is a project he and my father conceived over many years of conversation. I can assure you that of the many people that were close to him in the latter stages of his life, Bruce was really right up there near the top of the list. They worked so diligently together. On his last book, and Bruce was invaluable with his contributions, his editing, his collaborating. And I think he really appreciated my father's mind as much as anybody. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bruce Fraser.
Thank you, Steve. I think think one of the things that bothered Stan in recent years was the fact that he was called upon frequently to eulogize close friends. And although I never attended those occasions, I know he carried out this solemn task with his characteristic grace and eloquence and just the right touch of humor. Stan was a master of language, and I confess, at least in this moment, my words seem a little feeble, trying to capture the sentiment around his life and our friendship. A human life is immeasurable when we get down to it. We fit people into conventional categories such as friend, colleague, father, husband. Doing so helps us make sense of their role in our lives and perhaps gives us some measure of control or feeling of control over our grief and our loss. But, as you know, the richness of Stan's life is impossible to capture in this way. He was a father, husband, teacher, journalist, public intellectual, and a gentleman, in the best sense of the word. And he was also so much more than all of that, to all of us. Any one of us could expand the list of adjectives as we try to capture and keep the essence of Stan's life. He was extraordinary, curious, and wonderfully bright. He was thoroughly decent and kind. He was passionate and he was concerned with civic life and the future of our democracy. He was a believer in the power of education, and to my delight, often quoted Plato, saying that education is the highest good. He was also a man of stories. He could tell a tale better than anyone I've ever known. And he never seemed to lose sight of their relevance to our shared humanity. He was as comfortable rolling up his sleeves and working with students from troubled rural homes in eastern Florida as he was matching wits with the Ivy League students at Yale University. He walked with presidents and he broke bread with the common working man. I met Stan in 2006 when he came to Indian River State College as the inaugural speaker for our Fielding Institute for Lifelong Learning. I sat with him and his lovely wife, Joy, over lunch beforehand, and we hit it off immediately. We became fast friends and collaborators on a variety of projects, one of which, as Stephen mentioned, culminated in his last book, which I transcribed for him over the phone on Tuesday mornings for nearly 3 years. He would write the chapters out longhand and read them to me over the phone. He wasn't always easy to work with. We worked together because we inspired each other, we challenged each other, and because we loved each other. None of these descriptions do him justice, I grant. But in the end, language is all we have to eulogize those we love. It will have to suffice for me to say that Stanley Flink was my friend, and that he contributed immeasurably to my life. It was a great privilege to know him, and I will miss him terribly.
Before I introduce our next speaker, who of course is with us today, I have the great pleasure of reading a couple of eulogies to my father from two of his closest friends in Great Britain. As many of you know, he spent the years 1965 to 73, and by the way, I had to frequently correct him on the accuracy of those years because he wanted to move it back to 63 and how he left in 72, but that was not correct. He left the numbers to me, but he lived the life. But in any case, the two men I mentioned are Watkin Lewis, who was the best man at his wedding to Joy in 1975, and Watkin's son Damien, his godson, whom many of you know from, because he's such a renowned actor in You've seen him in various series and movies, and he was Dad's godson. So let me read these tributes to him first. First from Watkin. Stan came into my life in 1966 at a dinner party. The lady who was supposed to be sitting between us didn't show up, so we got to talking. He was interested in American politics, and so was I, having just returned from Chicago. We continued talking for the next 57 years, whether it was face-to-face or over the transatlantic telephone line, which it was for the last several decades. I'm already missing those calls. We always had plenty of laughs, and he had plenty of questions, always searching for differing points of view, which might have something to do with the fact that something we had believed previously, but he had usually done his homework very well, so it was difficult to shift his view. But he was always interested and even ever curious. Needless to say, the politics in our two countries took up a lot of time, with Trump and Johnson to the fore, along with world events, and of course the American Constitution before and after January 6th. Before our telephone life began, we were both bachelors in London, participating in everything it had to offer: theater, concerts, parties, balls, holidays. Skiing for the first time, and tennis, of course. And as it is well known, Stan has some special rules for tennis. It had to do with the ball being in or out. If the opponent hit a good shot, which was just in, Stan would declare it out, thereby winning the point. If he hit a shot which was just out in the opposite tram lines, he saw it differently and said it was in, forcing the opponent to play it again to avoid further delay. Time passed and I got married to Charlotte, and Stanley had to be the best man. Things moved quickly, and Damien was born on the 11th of February, 1971. I was waiting in the room for expectant parents for Stan. In came David Gordon, our gynecologist, immediately addressing and saying, "You have a beautiful red-headed baby boy." Stan didn't miss a beat. "It was a piece of cake," he said. Shocked and delighted, I pushed myself forward. Not to be done, however, our hero said, "I'll be his godfather." And history was made. There were too many special moments that occurred in our growing friendship, but Christmas time was very special when Stan came and stayed for a few nights. His greatest contribution was helping to fill the children's stockings. It was chaotic, but fun. Stan often put the wrong gift in the wrong stocking. It caused great amusement at breakfast to see Amanda wandering around in William's new rugby shirt, and William painting his nails and wondering what he should do with his ribbons. Everyone knew at that moment who Stan had been the night before. When Joy and Stan married, they visited us together, which was lovely for us all. It was a great wedding, and I agreed to be the best man, quite daunted, as Kingman Brewster, president of Yale at the time, had agreed to have the reception in his garden. A sizable marquee was put up. The sun shone and the place filled up with professors and their families, only to experience a very hot space inside. And no one had thought of rolling up the sides of the marquee. I was a bit nervous speaking in front of such a distinguished crowd, and with the heat heaping on, I was a dripping mess. Although I felt a bit like Custer, happily they were not taking prisoners that day, and all went well. The other big event I remember at that time was a joint holiday with Stan on Cushing's Island off the coast of Maine. Stan had rented a big holiday house on the island. We flew over to join him, and everyone was so excited, especially as the children had not been to the U.S. before. Whatever peace there had been was broken up by the English voices echoing all over the island. It was a marvelous experience and great fun for us all. Everyone who was there remembered Stan directing our activities with unbounded enthusiasm. We all loved it, and Stan's generosity was much appreciated. Well, my old friend, a lot of people find it difficult to keep friendships going over a long time, especially if they are somewhat long distance. This has not been our case over the years, And how lucky was it that we were able to visit you at the end of October last year before your latest fall, and just when you were getting over the one before. We were so lucky. And also to see you in such good spirits at the time. It was a particular bonus that Joy was able to get up and attend our lunch. We all miss you hugely, and I'm finding it difficult not to just pick up a telephone just for a chat. There are not many conversations that somewhere in our wider family you don't get a reference. You are part of us. You will be remembered forever with huge thanks and so much love, Joaquin. You can applaud. The next tribute is, of course, to his son, Damien, who writes the following. Put simply, Stanley was one of the most important people in my life. One of the great gifts as a parent is to choose a godparent for your children. When that godparent is Stanley Flink, you know you've hit the jackpot. Dad did well, so well, and I thank him deeply for it. Stanley was always curious, empathetic, funny, wise, attentive, and present. Not many godparents pull that off. He took his responsibility seriously, gave presents, arriving each Christmas with joy in a haze of expensive perfumes and Gucci's. The transatlantic glamour that they brought to North London each year was dazzling and exciting and would mean one very important thing for me, that I was going to get taken out to lunch to eat the biggest burger in London, Hard Rock Cafe, the great American disaster. By the age of 10, I was a connoisseur, just me and Stan. If he was here, we went. Later, he showed an interest in my acting. He brought me Jesus Through the Centuries by Jaroslav Pelikan when, as a young man, I started questioning God in that adolescent way. But he was patient and listened, and in turn, I read his books on press freedom when I was a grown man, and it made me proud. But not as proud as when I beat him at backgammon at one time in Florida. Everybody knows what a wonderful conversationalist he was. No one loved debate more than Stan and to discuss the issues of the day. His teaching gave him such joy, that was clear. To be around young, inquiring minds and be kept in touch with what the younger generations were thinking delighted him, I think. I loved him and his stories and his chat, and I'll miss him. And I'm cursing him too, because I never got out of him one major secret. Did he kiss Marilyn Monroe? Our next speaker, I've known him since the mid-60s. He's known my father since the mid-60s, David Kaiser. And that came about when the two families were living in London. My father was living in London and moved over that year, and same with Dave's father, who had a job over there at the time, a very important ambassadorial role. David is an historian. He's the author of numerous books. He taught at Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, the Naval War College, Williams College. He and his wife, Patty Cassidy, live in Watertown, Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Kaiser.
Thank you, Steve. Sorry. Stanley was indeed a dear friend of mine for a very long time, and I will have some things to say about that friendship as I go along. But I want to start by putting on my historian's hat to talk more generally about his extraordinary life. He was born in 1924 at the very end of his generation, known as the GI, or often the greatest generation. And he was in many ways quite a typical member of it. That was probably the most upwardly mobile generation in American history, and Stanley, like so many others, including my own father, moved up the ladder via the educational system, which in those days was very affordable. In his case, of course, going to Yale. Then, like most of the men in his generation, he served in the Second World War, an experience I never heard much about, actually. And like many others, he married early and in the 50s had Wendy and Steve. Now, his first career as a Hollywood reporter has already been mentioned, and many of us heard wonderful stories about that time. And in recent decades, I told Stanley more than once, you know, you really ought to write your autobiography, partly to hear those stories. But he never did. And I think the reason, perhaps, he did write other books, but no autobiography. And I think maybe the reason was that he never wanted to feel that his useful life was over, and that rather than spend some time writing up the past, he preferred to look for new ways to make the world a better place. Then he worked in television, didn't hear much about that either, and then, as Steve just mentioned, he and the rest of my family, because of my father's diplomatic posting, arrived in New York in '64 for my family and '65 for him at the same time. It was another wonderful family friend who I remember very fondly, Bill Atwood, who had been a fellow ambassador in Africa with my father and a UK native, I believe, of the Flinks, who told Stanley, you've got to meet this guy, Phil Kaiser. And he was right. It was love at first sight. They had a lot in common, and they enjoyed almost all the same things. My father was not the ambassador. He was the second in command in that embassy, but they had a very large house that was constantly full of people, and Stanley immediately became a frequent guest. He also became a frequent bridge partner, and later a tennis partner of my father's. He pursued both of those avocations with grace and skill. Tennis with my father was not an easy experience. I'm not telling tales out of school there. Stanley, my father's memorial, went into that subject in great detail. But Stanley could handle it. Now, I wasn't living in London. I was already in boarding school and then in college, and I was visiting Stanley about twice a year. But I managed to get to know him very well, too. He had a terrific knack for showing an interest in anyone he met. And although he was a great talker, he was also a wonderful listener. And he was one of my family's friends who always seemed to realize that there was something a little different about me from all the others. And that meant a lot. One story in particular I will never forget. My family, as I say, had lots of friends, lots of extended family, and they cared about a lot. But my parents were complicated people, and there was no one in their circle who did not, at one time or another, come in for harsh criticism behind their back. It just all depended on the mood they were in. And one day, it was Stanley's turn. I have no idea why. And I listened to a little of this, and getting more and more disgusted, and I must have said something about it to them and asked them what the hell they were doing. And a day or two later, my father said to me, you know, that Flink is a really smart guy. I called him, and he said to me, Phil, I've had it up to here with all you Kaisers. The only one who really cares about me is Dave. That meant a lot, and it still does. It was also during those London days that I met Wendy and especially Steve. Steve and I became very close later through tennis, among other things. But that's another story, perhaps for another event many years down the road. Now, there were more big changes to come in Stanley's life, which have been mentioned. He returned to Yale in 1972 to become public relations director. And Stanley, for all his geniality, could play hardball. I remember one story he told me about 60 Minutes doing some piece about Yale that threatened to be embarrassing. And I wish I could remember exactly what it was about, but I couldn't. But anyway, Don Hewitt, the legendary 60 Minutes producer, was on the phone to Stanley one day, threatening him with some revelation or trying to get him to give access to something, I don't know. And Stanley had had enough of it, and he said, hold it, Hewitt, I've got to hang up and call Paley, referring to William Paley, the president of CBS. He did hang up the phone, he explained, and about 15 seconds later, it rang again, and a much more cooperative Don Hewitt was on the other end of the line. Okay, and then came the most remarkable transformation in Stanley of all, already mentioned, when he really turned himself into a serious and very accomplished teacher and scholar in the last few decades of his life. Sentinel Under Siege is a history of the relationship between the government and the press, a quite concise one, just a few hundred pages, for the whole history of the Republic. That is the kind of book that professional historians used to write, but now very rarely do, and Stanley literally stepped into the breach. And then in 2019, when he was 95, he produced Due Diligence in the News, a commentary on the decline of the press in the digital age. He is one of two friends of mine, actually, to produce a fine book in their 90s. He was the older of the two, and they are both an inspiration for me, as I hope to look to more productive decades ahead. Now, I stayed in touch with Stanley over the last few decades, mostly by phone and whenever I could, in person. And as you all know, he was invariably cheerful, eager to talk about the news of the day, and to reminisce about days gone by, and always just as interested in what I was doing as I was in him. I remember his reaction to American Tragedy, a book I wrote on the origins of the Vietnam War that came out in 2000. The last few pages of that book, which I had written from an intensely personal viewpoint, had led to the worst argument I ever had with an editor in all my writing life. In fact, those pages stayed in the book, but I literally never spoke to that editor again. Stanley was one of a number of readers who singled out those pages as the most moving in the book, without my asking. And that meant a very great deal to me. And just 2 years ago, when I had written the first few chapters of the book I'm working on now, a relatively concise history of the U.S. based on presidential addresses, I sent them to him to read and got some very encouraging and good feedback. I'm very sad now that I cannot tell him that after a long struggle, I seem to have found a publisher for that book as well. Indeed, I have been quite shocked at how difficult his death has been for me. I'm old enough to have lost a great many friends and family, of course, and nearly all of them were younger when they died than he. I think there are two reasons, though, why this has been very hard. The first is that he was the last member of his generation with whom I was still in touch. My parents' generation and the generation that created the world in which I was lucky enough to grow up. But more than anyone else I can think of, in addition, Stanley remained Stanley, with his wit, energy, and constant interest in life, literally right up until the very end. The last time I spoke to him must have been in late November or early December of last year, before his last illness had begun, but after 2 serious health episodes earlier in the year. We talked to him, we talked as always, and he eagerly pointed me to the YouTube video of a talk he had just given here, I believe, about democracy. A video that was posted on November 21st, 2022. It shows a man in full possession of his faculties. And it's wonderful that that video will be there for all time. Stanley was a tower of strength for me, and clearly for many others, because right up until the end, you could count on him to be his wonderful self. And I too am going to miss him a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The next speaker is a highly unusual individual, a godsend, I would say, to be really frank and completely honest, because he met my father here at Evergreen Woods, much younger than most of the other residents, much younger than my father, practically a 2-decade gap between them. But in essence, there was no gap. Philosophically, there was not. They understood each other so well from the beginning and established this remarkable rapport, great joy spending time with each other day after day, taking walks, having intellectual discussions, having a lot of laughs, even some, shall we say, ill-fated attempts at cooking by both. That didn't work out so well, but everything else did. But John McGurk, I say he's a godsend because every time my sister or myself spoke to him on the phone in the last year or more, it would usually start with, well, McGurk was just telling me, just went for a walk with John today. And after a while, he wanted to see what place you should take in line. He was one of his children. That's how important John McGurk was. And I will also add that John was, we know him, we don't use his first name very often. So ladies and gentlemen, McGurk.
I once had a professor stand up and say, McGurk, in a large lecture hall. McGurk, who's McGurk? Stand up. So I did. He then explained that was the term that the guys working in the mines would call anyone who was an idiot. Speaking of idiots, I didn't know until David was introduced that he worked at Harvard, and he cleverly must have been the one that snuck in here and has Stanley sitting underneath the sign of Harvard. Yeah, I suspect, with 3 or 4 exceptions, I've known Stanley less time than anyone in this room. But we spent a lot of time together. Stanley moved here about 7.5 years ago. And when he did, the people who were management here came down, and for some reason they'd heard of Stanley Flink. And they asked him to give some lectures. And as you probably can surmise, Stanley, being reticent and shy, he agreed to do that. And apparently for 4 or 5 years, he gave 40 a year. And then the last 2 or 3 years, I think it was, every other week. You know, he started slowing down, and then had to ended up, as a matter of fact, he had what he called the last lecture here a couple of months ago. And the place was packed, and he got a standing ovation, and besides a few tomatoes thrown, he really appreciated that. Well, we all heard, I'm hearing stories, by the way, I've heard a few of these stories before, you might be shocked to know. Recently, many of the people here who knew Stanley came up to me and said how much they enjoyed the things that Stanley did, particularly the lectures, but they got to know him in other ways too. Some sitting with him at dinner, we had little talk groups and all that, and one of the things that was mentioned about kindness. I did lead a different life than Stanley, but I thought that so much that was a very good description of Stanley Flink. He just was a kind person. You can't do that, I think, in some areas of living. I've been here 3 years. I moved in my wife, and Kathy had ALS. And I think at the end of the first month I was here, they have a magazine they publish every 2 weeks. As a matter of fact, one came in my mailbox yesterday. And guess whose article was right in front? That set me back a little. Anyway, I read this article years ago. I'm going, what is this? So I said, Kathy, there's some guy here named Stanley Flink, and he can write. He had it all in there, the meat was there, it was just, wow. I sat down, wrote him a long note, got up, walked outside, started to walk around this road here, and 2 fellows came walking down. One of them, Phil Vance, like met before, and he said, John, you know Stanley Flink? And I said, Stanley Flink? And we started talking. 3 years later, we stopped. But I went back to my room, stuck a note under his door that I had there, and he called me, and we started walking and talking, and on we went. It was wonderful, I think, for both of us. Steve said a few things. Yes, we were different. You know, I spent some years working in a shipyard. I worked for 10 years in the longshoreman part-time. I worked on a railroad. I think it took me 16 years to get some college degrees. And of course, Stanley had a slightly different background. But despite his, you know, less than stellar education, and starting in South Orange, New Jersey, which I suspect many of you have heard about, and of course that Yale and Oxford stuff, that we seemed to be able to get along and had some things oddly in common. After about the third or fourth walk, Stanley said, "We're going to write a play. This is the odd couple. We've got our," he's going on and on about Stan, we're not going to write a play. And after the 17th time, he said, "Look, Stan, no play, but here's the title." Do you remember? The Prodigy and Stevedore. He loved it. Oh, that's wonderful. And he went, and we went back to his apartment that day, and he said to Joy, and Joy said, "I think I know which one you were, Stanley." Joy, who he loved so much. We had very different life experiences, but it worked for us, and we spent a huge amount of time together. I know an awful lot of people here thought very highly of Stanley for many different reasons. And he was a good friend to so many people. And he was a good friend to an old stevedore, too.
This has been some phenomenal lineup, wouldn't you say? And you're not going to be disappointed by the next speaker. She's just a soul-of-the-earth woman who, by the way, was kind enough to help us get this ceremony filmed today so that others who were unable to attend are going to be able to see this on video, which I'm so pleased about. But Kate Benton Doohan, she lives in Los Angeles with her husband Jim and their 2 sons, Charlie and Hank, all devotees and card-carrying members of the Stan Flink fan club. Formerly an actress, Kate is now in her 28th year at the Harvard Westlake School, where she was a teacher and formerly an actress, and formerly head dean of grades 7 to 9 at the middle school. She recently joined the advancement office as a major gifts officer. Some of her former students went on to become students of my father's, an honor and experience they still talk about today. Ladies and gentlemen, Kate Benton.
Wow, what an intro. Thank you. You're going to hear some recurring themes from me, I'm sure. Stan was enviably vital and interested in the world. I'm also a sentimentalist, so I may cry at times, but I'll barrel through. Stan was enviably vital and interested in the world and loved all of us tremendously, and I'm real lucky we got to love him back. When my mother Kitty heard that Stan had passed away, she said, "Boy, when St. Peter saw Pope Benedict, Barbara Walters, and Stan Flink all arriving at the same time, he must have said, 'I quit.'" I'm one of 4 Benton daughters of Nick and Kitty Benton. I'm also one of 17 of Stan's godchildren. 17! Although in a way the real number is much greater. He was much a godfather to me as he was to my 3 sisters, and to the Blinn and the Mackenzie families, and countless others. Our long-lasting family relationship with Stan revolved around the deep friendship we had with my father, Nick Benton, who's in that picture over there. I'm not sure the exact year, but Nick and Stan first met in the early 50s when they were both employed by Time Life as reporters during the great days of Henry Luce. At a classic Hollywood party, rife with movie stars, Nick overheard someone trashing Time Life. So he insinuated himself in the conversation and defended the company. As Stan and Nick like to say, cut to, the following week, back in New York at the Time Life building on 6th Avenue, Nick was waiting for the elevator when the doors opened and Stan walked out. Nick said, "What are you doing here?" And Stan said, "I work here." And it was love from then on. One of the first times Stan met my mother, Kitty, my parents were having breakfast with Stan at a restaurant, and grapefruit was served. Stan remembered, "When I was in Egypt, they served us grapefruit in every way you can imagine. Juiced, sectioned, sliced, grilled." He finished saying, "What else could one possibly do with grapefruit?" To which my mother responded, "This." And she picked up his grapefruit and ground it in his face like Jimmy Cagney did to make Clark in the Republican enemy #1. Stan was stunned. And then, of course, they all roared with laughter. Now great friends, Stan and Nick formed Benton and Flink Productions, although that would change from Flink to Benton Productions, to Benton and Flink to Flink and Benton. And in 1958, they brought a musical that was a hit in London to New York called Salad Days. Their star, Dick Easton, was quite tall, and before opening night, he was offered a contract to play professional basketball and quit the show. Their agent suggested an up-and-comer with no credits as a replacement, to which Stan said, "No way!" And they turned down Warren Beatty. They also produced 3 plays by A.R. Gurney, The Perfect Party and Children, both off-Broadway, and on Broadway, The Golden Age, starring Irene Worth, Stockard Channing, and Jeff Daniels. They loved calling each other Mr. Producer. And then there was this famous annual pilgrimage and tailgate party to the Harvard-Yale game alternating between New Haven and Cambridge, with the Bentons, Flinks, Blinds, Mackenzies, Lamonts, and Harbachs. Nick being a Harvard man and Stan being a Yaley gave them even more fuel for competition, yet always with immense love and always humor. Stan and Joy would visit us every summer in Wareham, Mass, and they continued that tradition every year, even after Nick died, until 2 years ago when it became too difficult to make the drive. How we would look forward to their visits. Joy would ask, "What are you reading?" Stan would ask what we thought about what was happening currently in the news. Nick and Stan stayed in their swim trunks all day long and played backgammon and gin rummy. Their games would consume the weekend. When they would play gin, Stan would win. And when they played backgammon, Nick won. So they would set a clock to change games every 30 minutes. They were both intensely competitive and would bet money. I remember one lucky roll of double sixes garnered the exclamation, "Shoot the juice to Henry Luce." And of course, with money on the line, they would accuse each other of cheating, and inevitably the winner would run a few laps around the table with When Stan was living in London, he frequently stayed with us while visiting in New York, sleeping on the pull-out couch in our den on 69th Street. He was fond of telling a story about me as a 5-year-old one morning. I threw open the doors and ran across Stan, sleeping in the bed, landing squarely on his crotch. I flew open the windows and yelled out at one of the neighborhood kids, "Gregory! Gregory! Pow pow, you're dead!" And I ran out of the room. And there was a summer when my boys were young, when it was time for books before bed. We had a book by Dr. Seuss about a boy who overstayed his welcome and wouldn't go home. It was called Marvin K. Mooney, Will You Please Go Now? Stan loved this book, and the boys loved it when he read it to them, and to this day we can't read it without hearing Stan's delivery. While there was much humor in our visits with Stan, there was also so much intellect and insight in every conversation. Stan had a remarkable way of engaging all types of people and of all ages. He never tired of learning. He was interested and interesting until the end. My mother and sister Emily and I had the privilege of hearing his lecture this past summer in this very room on how artificial intelligence is permeating society, our government and educational institutions, and the dangers that come with relying on robots to think and feel for us, ultimately eroding democracy. His last talk on democracy in November built upon that theme, and with his deep love for the fundamental principles of freedom, equality, decency, and humanity, he charged all of us to be aware of what's happening around us in the world. His last talk ended with a standing ovation, and he told me how deeply moved he was to be received with such praise. Ever the producer, he knew when to close the show, leave them wanting more. So how apropos that on the last day of this past year, Stan exited stage right, knowing he brought down the house with a standing ovation. I like to think that when he left us, Nick was waiting for him, saying, well, it's about time. Hurry up. Your deal. I'll start the clock.
What can I say about the next individual who's about to step up to this microphone? He's a very modest, fundamentally decent, great man in my view. Truly great man. I asked David McKenzie to give me how he would like to be introduced. And most people, given that invitation, they're rather expansive. And why not? Especially when they let accomplished lives. David simply said this. I think it's enough to say David McKenzie is another longtime friend and admirer of Stan, and also a Yale graduate. Well, he's much, much more than that. He was one of the most dedicated friends my father had in his entire life. They shared so much laughter and good times and camaraderie. And no, they didn't agree on everything. Politics were different. There were, I'm sure, some serious issues between them, but they really loved each other. And I appreciated David's enduring loyalty, and I knew it because we had discussions, private discussions ourselves about my father, and his affection for him came through every single time we talked. So I'm really delighted to introduce one of my father's, one of the most important friends in his life, David McKenzie.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to be a little repetitive because we're deep into the program, but for such a great guy like Stan, it's worth repeating. Am I doing all right on the microphone, Jim? I first met Stanley over 40 years ago at Nick and Kitty Ben's summer home on Buzzards Bay. Daytime activities involve swimming and sailing, so I invited Stan to take a sail with me on the Sunfish. As we stood offshore in knee-deep water, Stan climbed on board saying, "Thank God I'm with somebody who knows what they're doing." I confidently pointed the boat out to Buzzards Bay, got on board, and with a flourish, hauled in the sail. Unfortunately, I misread the wind. It took about a few seconds for the boat to spin around and drive us back towards the shore, and grounding the boat firmly on the beach. Stan was surprised and a little shocked. So was I. He forgave me and our friendship began, but he never sailed with me again. Stan was quick to remind me that Flink means good guy in Danish. Well, there's no question he lived up to that description, but he was much more. A wonderful blend of intellect, charm, and good humor. He drew on a broad range of interests and experience, and was always stimulating to be with. One of his finest attributes was that rare ability to listen. You didn't have to subscribe to Stan's way of thinking, just be willing to exchange ideas. The result was that he made new friends easily, and those friendships lasted a lifetime. That was certainly true for me. Usually photos in silver frames on a piano are reserved for family and their moments with close friends. I'm no different, and on mine is a black and white photo of Stanley, but he's not with me. Instead, he has his arms around Marilyn Monroe, who is leaning back against him with a sultry smile and half-closed eyes, while Stan, only in his late 20s, is looking happy and perhaps a little nervous because he can't believe his good fortune. Stan's years in Hollywood gave him endless stories to draw upon, and that, combined with his ability with words, made him the best raconteur imaginable. No one can conjure up images better than Stan. He remembered with infinite detail his times with Marilyn, Zsa Zsa, Cary Grant, and so many others. I heard most of these stories multiple times, but each time they were fresh and entertaining. I began telling them on my own, trying to improve my chances of getting asked out for dinner. It never worked. Stan had to tell his own stories in his own way. Considering his strong commitment to Yale, it's no wonder Stan became a loyal supporter of the football team. Regardless of the weather, he would head out to Yale Bowl for all the home football games, preceded, of course, by the obligatory tailgate in the VIP parking lot. And a lot of food by Dr. Gettman over there. One of my favorite pictures is of Stan at a Harvard-Yale game, and it turns out there it is. It shows him sitting, mine is in color. It shows him sitting on the open back of a station wagon. He's wearing tan corduroys, a Brooks Brothers shirt, a Yale logo tie, a Harris tweed sport coat, a blue cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders, and an ear-to-ear smile that spelled complete happiness. At his feet is handsome Dan the Yale Bulldog, who is also smiling. I mentioned Stan's clothes specifically because all his life he was such a sharp dresser. While Stan was in college, he said his father complained bitterly that it cost more to pay Stan's bill at J Press than to pay for the tuition. Stan's immensely popular seminar called Ethics in the Media was consistently oversubscribed. He had to interview all the prospective students to see which ones were the best qualified. I had the privilege of attending a couple of those classes and saw just why it was so popular. Stan made learning history both exciting and entertaining, and he enhanced the presentations with stories from Hollywood. At the end of the course, after term papers were submitted, he would write a long and thoughtful critique for each student, giving constructive suggestions and ideas. I don't recall that level of commitment from any professor during my years at Yale. At the conclusion of each semester, the class invariably gave Professor Flink a standing ovation. By the way, Stan always modestly insisted that because he didn't have a PhD, he wasn't entitled to be called professor. Nobody paid attention to that, since anyone who knew Stan felt he had earned the title simply based on his contribution to scholarship. Stan was the gold standard on how you should keep your mind active and never stop learning. He stayed curious and productive his entire life, never resting on his laurels, and always challenging himself with new projects. Even into his 90s, when most people focus on kicking back and relaxing. If you were lucky enough to attend the lectures here at Evergreen Woods, you'd have seen someone who hadn't slowed down at all from his teaching at Yale. He'd begin by writing 6 subjects on a whiteboard, and then without any notes, speak for an hour, fluently and passionately about each subject. His most recent lectures dealt with a very avant-garde subject of artificial intelligence. I remember that this was a little bit of an anomaly, since he didn't own a PC or use an iPhone, and preferred to do his writing with a good old-fashioned pencil and pad, or foolscap, as Stan used to call it. But that didn't stop him from a headfirst plunge into the very technical and topical subject of AI. Stan wanted his lectures to deal with the issues of today, with the added benefit of seeing them through the lens of history that he knew so well. Though I'm a great admirer of Stan's intellectual pursuits and his many accomplishments as an author, journalist, lecturer, and more, our relationship was more heavily focused on the fun side of life. We both liked to play golf, but tennis was his favorite sport, and he won the New Haven Lawn Club Open 3 times. The Flinks, Bentons, and Mackenzies. Played a lot of tennis over the years, and Stan was clearly the best player. He had smooth ground strokes and a full repertoire of dinks, chops, and lobs. His only weakness, from our point of view, was his bad mind calls. So we started challenging him. He would challenge right back. The testiness and frequency of the challenges kept increasing to the point that I had to beg Stan to please not call out until I served the ball. Considering the devotion to tennis, it's not surprising that Steve got heavily involved in the game at a young age and became a tennis reporter and analyst. When Steve would fly to London to broadcast matches from Wimbledon, Stan, the relentless wordsmith, would send him home with a list of choice words, like brio or allow, that he could weave into his broadcast. I guess it all paid off, since later in his career, Steve was inducted into the Tennis Hall of Fame. Did you know that Stan took tap dancing lessons in his 60s? Maybe it was his Hollywood contact with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly that inspired him to do it. But I like to think it was all in preparation for a home video we made called Taps for the Tapper, involving the usual suspects, Flinks, Bentons, and Mackenzies. This melodramatic, lighthearted, and, dare I say, timeless production involved a murder, a subsequent investigation, and ultimately the arrest of the killer. Yes, justice was finally served, but the true crime in the video was a scene involving the entire cast tap dancing on the cement apron around my pool in time to loud music from a boombox. Stan, Joy, and Kitty had real tap shoes. They were better. And the rest of us attached bottle caps to our loafers. Subsequent analysis has revealed three things. One, we had a lot of fun making it. Two, we were obviously going through an unsustainable midlife crisis. Three, we should never give up our day jobs. And no, there are no CD copies available for purchase in the lobby. You probably know Stan was a staunch Democrat. I like to tell him that he was my mentor, and that I, on the other hand, as a political opposite, was his tour mentor. He agreed wholeheartedly with my self-description and began to refer to me as a poor, twisted devil. In the closing sentence of one of his notes to me, he wrote, "I remain as always your friend and admirer who respects your persistence in trying to convert me. Keep trying." His good friend William F. Buckley Jr. also tried, with no success. Having spent an important part of my life, part of his life, amongst Hollywood stars, it was probably inevitable that Stan would become one himself. In fact, many times Stan was mistaken in public for the very handsome and debonair Stuart Granger, a British film actor who played heroic and romantic leading roles. Once when we were at the checkout counter at a Florida Walmart, a clerk pointed at Stan and stammered, "Stuart Granger." On the way home, Stan and I speculated that probably at that very moment, somewhere on Rodeo Drive, there were teenagers gathered around Stuart Granger, pointing at him in awe and stammering, "Stanley Flink." Stan was also a devoted backgammon player, and together with Nick Benton, we must have played thousands of games. The stakes were modest, just $1 a point on the doubling die. But over the years, thousands of dollars must have changed hands, with no one really getting any richer. All games were played with a continuing stream of verbal abuse, outrage at the double sixes that were thrown by an opponent, and the demand that the winner not act cocky or smug, since that would never be allowed at the Regency Club. For many years, Stan was the corresponding secretary for the class of 45W. His notes in the Yale Alumni magazine were much more than just a casual recap of what was going on with classmates, or the sad reporting of those who had passed. Instead, Stan would include a poignant bit of philosophy or observations regarding current events. Predictably, he started getting feedback from alumni in other classes. They had read his notes and had become regular fans. Stan told me that he really loved his expanded audience and how much it meant to him to have that connection with other Yale alumni. Ironically, his last submission appeared in the alumni magazine that I received just last week. Stan's notes were longer than usual and dealt with the fragility of our democracy and the threats to it from social media. As always, his comments were passionate, relevant, and thoughtful. I've printed extra copies of them if you would like to pick up one after the service. I like to imagine that Stan is now in heaven, reunited with his parents and his 2 golden retrievers. I visualize crowds of people moving rapidly in one direction, and one person is saying to another, "Where's everybody going?" "Didn't you hear?" comes the answer. "Stanley Flink will be here, and we all want to sit next to him." Stan, we've loved all the times we had a chance to sit next to you. We love you. We miss you, and we thank you for being such a meaningful and memorable part of our lives.
My next introduction, I don't think I've ever had the chance to do this, actually. In fact, I'm certain I haven't, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity because I'm introducing my sister, Wendy Levy, 2 years older than I am. I don't say that. Let me explain the context. I'm a bit jealous of her in that regard because that meant that she knew my father 2 more years than I did. She had the benefit of his wisdom and humor and all of his great traits that much longer. But more seriously, she's been one of the preeminent nursing school directors in New York. She ran a school for about over 40 years. She's a consultant in that field now. And she had a different relationship with my father than I did, but they were very much alike in many, many ways. And I know you'll learn a lot more from listening to her right now. Wendy Levy.
Yeah, it's very different. It's fitting now that we all get to speak for Dad, as he was always the one called on to MC an evening, deliver a eulogy, introduce a speaker or an event, make a wedding toast, and raise a glass, always with a perfect bon mot. Steve and I have received so many notes about Dad. One remarked that Dad's last lecture a few months ago, he even discusses Alan Turing, and it's great how he breaks everything down for people who might be unaware. That's a supreme educator. Another letter said, "Your father is one of the people who guide and shape the huge marble slab that is our national perspective." And yet another said, "I know you are proud, and you should be, from his interviewing Marilyn Monroe to writing about artificial intelligence. The number of people who did both of those is 1. There are so many stories to tell when I think of my father. After all, he lived 98 years. And Steve, I did know him first. For example, when he helped a woman on with her coat, he always pulled her hair out so it wouldn't be caught in the collar. He loved sending women flowers, especially to Joy. He loved clothes, and he always looked impeccably put together. To the very end, dressed in a dress shirt and khakis, and that was his casual look. He always had his hair neatly combed, and as a teenager, when we traveled in Europe and were somewhere swimming, he kept a small comb
in his Brooks Brothers swim trunks, just for touch-ups and chance meetings with someone of note. And that full head of hair he took such pride in, even refusing to let doctors shave a little bit when a car convertible top fell on his head and cut his scalp. As they took him off in the ambulance, I heard him bellowing, "Don't touch the hair!" Steve's wife, Frances, masterfully took over almost everything in Dad and Joy's life to make their lives easier, not the least of which was cutting his hair, which he liked done every 2 weeks. After all, he went down to the dining room here at Evergreen and needed to look very good for all of his many admirers. My role in recent years was smaller, but pivotal. I brought him licorice and ginger cookies, his favorite foods, and I ordered him stationery so he could write all of his notes to people. Dad loved Yale. The friends he made when he was a student in Branford College in the 1940s, to the people he met teaching at Yale, to those he met working in public communications at Yale, to all his friends here at Evergreen, especially John McGurk. Known in our family, just like Madonna, simply as McGurk. The two of them walked and talked endlessly, and he lived on Dad's floor. He spent lots of time with Dad. Dad loved Yale's intellectual rigor, the traditions, and the ivy-covered buildings. He reveled in giving my children and their friends tours of the campus, all the while regaling them with stories about Morey's, a private eating club, or the secret societies, or Yale football lore, and how he loved the Yale-Harvard game, known to insiders as the game. This past November, Steve, Frances, Richard, Joy, and I watched it with him, and he was jubilant that they beat Harvard. Although with his poor eyesight, Joy had to reassure him that they really had won the game. Dad was possessed of a consummate memory. He could remember the actress Marion Davies' home address from when he was interviewing her, and the newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst had just died in her home in 1951, and Steve and I checked the date, and had to be spirited out of the house to avoid scandal. And the names of every starlet or politician or scientist he met, and something of note about each one. When the Queen of England died recently, I asked, "Did you know her?" And he said, "We met." She wanted to know all about American theater as opposed to English theater. Recently, I met a woman in my apartment building who had just visited her family in South Orange, New Jersey, where Dad was from. She asked where he had lived, and when I called him to find out, he remembered his street address immediately from the 1930s and told me all about the house and where on the street the house was, just in case she knew it. Dad had a real workaround style when it came to rearing children. For example, when we were little in New Canaan, Connecticut, and he burnt the toast for our breakfast, he told us this was intentional. It was a well-known cure for the common cold. As teenagers, when Dad lived in London, Steve got to play tennis at the Queen's Club every day. I took tours of Yale kids who looked him up in London, all over the city, to museums and historical sites, and then I wrote up the experiences at night in a journal for review by Dad. Written words mattered in our house. When I was at college in Boston, I wrote Dad in London, and the letters would be returned with red circles saying, "Poor use of word," or "run-on sentence." And they were signed F. Scott Fitzgerald, an homage to F. Scott Fitzgerald, my favorite author. So it is no surprise that Steve became a tennis savant and writer, and I became an educator. Dad supported, encouraged, and inspired Steve to become a talented sports writer, and he was elected to the Tennis Hall of Fame. No one was more proud than my dad to see his son heralded and honored by his beloved tennis world, telling anyone and everyone, "That's my son Steve. I taught him everything he knows." He equally loved that I became a teacher, and then started a school in the 1970s, and more recently established an educational consulting business. In fact, saying only 2 weeks ago, "I told you that's what you should do." He loved hearing about my son Evan and his wife Marissa's children, Blake and Jordan, and all their hilarious escapades. He loved to watch almost 8-year-old Blake's frequent TikTok dance videos and 5-year-old Jordan's skiing, baseball, and tennis videos. He loved racing down the hall with them here at Evergreen when they visited. And the very last thing he said to my daughter Marielle on this past Christmas Day when we called him was, "Give my love to Hudson, her 6-month-old son." My friends and my family loved all the stories about the Hollywood stars that he interviewed and met while working at Life magazine in the 50s. Grace Kelly, Sophia Loren, Cary Grant, Lucille Ball, Natalie Wood, William Holden, Marilyn Monroe, Warren Beatty, and so many more. But his true passion was always the news. Politics, freedom, social equity, and democracy. He wrote and lectured about it at Yale and NYU, in Florida at Indian River State College, and most recently here at Evergreen. He spoke extemporaneously, easily and proficiently. Just before the pandemic, he even wrote and got a book published with the help of Bruce Frazier, Due Diligence in the News. Actually, if he were here, he would be asking us to hand out copies to all of you. And when I told him that I was talking to his school head in New York, he'd say, "Did you mention my book?" And Steve, Francis, and I were his total promotion team. Oddly, while my father loved learning about and talking about artificial intelligence, he never quite mastered the art of Googling. And I would get frequent calls saying, "When? There was a piece on so-and-so last week in the New York Times, and I can't find it. Can you find it, print it out, and then send it to me in the mail?" And I would. It just wasn't worth explaining to him for the 90th time the more efficient way to do this. As brilliant as he was, the cell phone was anathema, and he never understood how to get on demand on the television. When we were kids, we had no pets. But along came Dad's great love, Joy, in 1974. And first they had Joy's cats, and then their 2 beloved dogs, Sam and Hannah. And then Dad even had a horse named Domino here in Connecticut. He was crazy about these animals. He even carried Sam's picture in his wallet. Not my picture, not Steve's picture, because Sam's picture. Little known talents where Dad was a superb photographer, using his beloved Rolling, and he made a film out of the iconic children's book, Harold and the Purple Crayon. Dad loved keeping up with both Steve's and my friends, and he wanted to know what everyone was doing. This past October, my closest childhood friend Lorraine and I went to see him, and he wanted to know all the details of her family film business and had it been affected by the pandemic. He laughed with us about our visits with him in London in the 60s, remembering details that we had forgotten. He loved hearing about my friends the Atlases and Nancy's work as a judge in Texas and Scott's myriad legal cases, especially when he appeared before the Supreme Court to argue a pro bono case. He would ask me about my friend Kathy from high school. I think in this case, mostly because I told him once she had described him as a rogue, and he loved that. He loved taking my son Evan as a youngster and my nephews to Yale games and letting them walk the Yale Bulldog, Dandy Don, on the field. When my daughter wanted her friends, Eli and Fergus, and her husband Jaron to have a tour of Yale, Dad did so with such relish and significant detail that spellbound all of them. No one gave a better tour of Yale, and few have loved Yale with the fervor, respect, and passion that he did. Dad loved to dance. He was famous for, wait for it, the Peabody Dip. He loved the sun, and he was obsessed with his reflector, which he brought to London in 1963.
65.
It never ends. Okay, 65, along with the barbecue, which he got the department store Peter Nichols to import for all others in London to enjoy. He loved the theater, tennis, paddle tennis, and golf, which he took up in later years when tennis was too arduous, and shared his newfound passion with my son Evan, marveling at how far Evan could hit the ball. He loved playing backgammon. Oh, how he loved playing with Nick Benton. as they screamed and yelled at each other, rolling the dice. He taught my daughter Marielle to play, and she loves the game too, and promptly taught her husband Jaron when they were courting. He loved his, I thought, 14 godchildren. Again, I guess I'm going to be corrected. Apparently there are 17 of you people. He also loved that I finally found sweet Richard, a man who also respects and loves the written language to spend my life with after a previous marital misstep. And I know that he would love that he was the last news story of 2022. In December, newswoman Barbara Walters died. The great tennis player Dick Sabat died. The soccer impresario Pele died. And then, on New Year's Eve, Stanley Flink became the last great person of the year to go and close out the news cycle. It's taken me a long time to figure out that the very worst part of my dad was also the very best part of my dad. He always held us to the highest standard. He never tolerated lethargy, sloppiness, or intellectual laziness. And while it wasn't always easy, both Steve and I benefited enormously from that high bar in developing and sustaining our own passions, gaining moral compasses, and having meaningful, productive careers. And now he leaves that long-lasting legacy for our children and grandchildren. Dad taught me so much. He gave me drive and grit and an appreciation for words and books. And he taught me to follow my passion and have a passion. He taught me to care about the world and the people who shape it. He taught me to speak my voice. He taught me to be socially responsible. He taught me to love theater, sports, books, art, education, and film. And he taught me that children are the future. I am grateful beyond words, Dad. Your life was epic, and you sure left your mark. Now you join your parents, Frankie and Jules, and your beloved sister Millicent, and I'm quite sure Uncle Nick has the backgammon board set and some great stories ready for you. As you would always say, Godspeed. I love you, Dad.
All I can say after listening to that speech is, could we have that applause last a little longer, please? Before I start, I just want to invite everybody, we're going to have a little reception here. You just walk down the hall and there'll be some refreshments and you can mingle between this room, go to the hallway into that smaller room. We'd like all of you to stay for that and have a chance to visit. Over the course of the last hour and a half, you've been provided a pretty full portrait of my father by a number of important and longtime friends, by two of his four grandchildren, and my one sibling. So I'll now conclude this memorial with my tribute to Stanley as a second child and only son. It's an exceedingly difficult task because he meant so much to such a wide range of people. He was, to be sure, an inimitable figure in all of our lives, an irreplaceable individual who lived life to the hill, and a man of many virtues and few flaws. We enjoyed an extraordinary relationship which transcended, in a number of respects, even the closest and most enduring father-son bonds that have come into my view. What we shared simply can't be conveyed as deeply as I would hope or want in a short eulogy at the end of a long and sweepingly potent life. Probably only our wives, they're the only ones who understood the scope of the bond that I had with my father. But I'll try to share with you how he guided me as a parent, what it was like to be the son of someone so formidable, such a major figure in my life. Let me start with some memories of when I was growing up and benefiting from his wisdom and his generosity. It was a remarkable childhood. At 6, I was playing marbles with William Holden, the renowned actor, in his hotel room. When I was 8, in the summer of 1960, Dad took me to a number of Yankee games. And one day that summer, he arranged to get us into the clubhouse meet famous players including Mickey Mantle and Branford, and even go into the dugout and get my picture taken with the gregarious manager, Casey Stengel. To this day, I cherish that picture. How many sons were raised by a father who could pull off a feat like that? At the time, he knew he could have given me no greater gift than to spend that day at Yankee Stadium and meet those luminaries. In 1967, when I was 15, going away to prep school in Massachusetts, he was concerned I might come across students who were anti-Semitic. Steve, he said, if and when some despicable kid gets you aside and goes down that dark path, just let him finish the tirade and then look him in the eye and say, that's all very interesting, but where do you get your facts? Sure enough, a classmate cornered me a few months later in the hallway right before recess, unleashing a cluster of anti-Semitic remarks. The frightening flurry of vile words lasted perhaps 2 minutes, but it seemed much longer. I waited for the culprit to stop, and then I pounced, certain I would score a verbal knockout. Okay, Sam, everything you said is very interesting, so where do you get your facts? He replied, oh, that's a good one. Did your father tell you to say that? I walked away dumbfounded, amazed by that retort. When I recounted what had happened the next time I saw my father, he looked simultaneously astounded, disgusted, and mildly amused. It was one of those rare moments in my life when I can recall Dad unable to summon any words whatsoever. He was absolutely speechless. About a year later, I was listening to a Yale-Harvard football game, the famous 1968 game, on my radio in the prep school dormitory room. This was the infamous battle at Harvard when Yale led 29-13 with less than 2 minutes to go, before Harvard improbably rallied to tie the game and emerged with a moral victory. In fact, the Harvard Crimson headline read, Harvard beats Yale 29-29. As I listened apprehensively to the end of that god-awful game, it was more than I could handle. I reached for my hairbrush and hurled it at the wall. But teenage fury led to a very poor result. I watched in dismay as the hairbrush hit the window and, of course, shattered it. The next day, I sat down and wrote a letter to my father, apologizing profusely, anticipating a stern lecture in response. Much to my surprise and relief, he wrote back swiftly and said, I understand completely why you broke that window. And in the interest of Yale, I'm going to pay for it. All I ask is that you aim more accurately next time. He was always a tough disciplinarian, but the bark would often be bigger than the bite. When we would play our father-son tennis matches, and David McKenzie's going to enjoy this, I'd become infuriated with the endless stream of chips, dinks, and drop shots he sent my way. It was a nightmare playing against him in singles. So one day, I blasted the ball over the fence in exasperation, and he stopped our match right then and there. That's it, he said, you're not playing tennis for 2 weeks. I begged him to reconsider as we left the court, but he was adamant. I told him I would never behave that way on the court again. 2 long days went by before I timidly asked him if I could play again that afternoon. There was a pause, and then he responded, yes, but learn your lesson and keep your cool. As I moved into adulthood and started my career as a tennis journalist, he was invaluable in helping me hone my craft, write with more depth, polish, and clarity. As he had done across his career so successfully in a wider world, I combined my work in print, just as he had, with broadcasting on radio and television. He would encourage me at every stage to avoid adjective repetition in any of these endeavors and be supremely disciplined. Naturally, even though I admired his eloquence and craftsmanship so deeply, we would have disagreements. He objected vehemently to my starting paragraphs with the word but. In his old school view, that was a no-no. He first brought this to my attention when I was in my 30s, and I would point to the work of one accomplished writer after another who was on my side of the argument, as Dad and I continued our debate, all the way into this past year. He didn't give in, but he conceded that others might have shared my view. All through my career, he enjoyed our dialogue about everything from sports to politics to our mutual journalistic interests. He knew himself unfailingly well. A case in point was when he called me once while he was in his late 70s. He had been perhaps offering even more advice than usual to me on a wide range of matters, both personal and professional. Now, uncharacteristically, he seemed to be reconsidering his posture. Steve, I promise Joy that I will stop giving you such a hard time about some of these things. After all, you're in your 40s, and I told her I'd back off with some of this nagging and just give you a break. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. For a long moment, there was a silence between us. I wondered if I'd heard him correctly. I sat there incredulously on the other side of the telephone line, wondering when the other shoe was going to drop. Well, it did. All right, said my father, now that I've kept my word to Joy, I want to know, have you written that second draft on your latest article? Have you called your agent yet? Have you brushed your hair back and taken off your jacket in the car so you don't wrinkle it? And what are you doing about your expanding waistline? At that point, we both broke into almost uncontrollable laughter. Old habits die hard. On another occasion, Dad described his philosophy on his dealings with me quite well when asked about it by David McKenzie. He told David, Steve and I work through our disputes fair and square. He gives me his point of view, and I listen. I give him my viewpoint, and he listens. And then, of course, we do it my way. Where did he develop that sense, that wonderful sense of self and sense of humor we all appreciated so much? I believe the role of his parents, Julius and Francis, better known as Frankie, has been underplayed over time. They shaped him in countless ways and instilled so many virtues in him. Stylistically, he differed from his parents, but in sum and substance, they were strikingly similar to him in wanting to separate right from wrong, to live with a clear set of convictions and ethical guidelines, and to put dignity and honesty above all other human qualities. As many of you know, he was a masterful eulogist, speaking at memorials for a multitude of friends and family members. He cherished giving these eulogies because invariably people he never knew would approach Dad afterwards to tell him how many emotional chords he had struck and how skillfully he had encapsulated the life of whomever he had just addressed. It gave him immeasurable pride to move his audiences so powerfully. I was present for a lot of those eulogies, but the two which stand out in my mind were those he delivered so poignantly for his mother and his father. His mother, an accomplished lawyer, served as a judge advocate in the United States Navy during World War I and passed away in 1985. And his father, an estimable accountant, died the following year. They were kind, considerate, compassionate, and fundamentally decent people who were outstanding grandparents as well. In his eulogy for his mother, Dad wrote, "Mother was never less than an old-fashioned girl. There were a number of times when she could see just down the metaphorical road an opportunity to break away, to be propelled into another kind of life, perhaps a career in public service or industry. These were opportunities she rarely talked about. Whatever the temptations, a hard-driving career required dispassionate, calculated ambition, and she was not made of such stuff. She met another old-fashioned type, my father, and made her choice. The wisdom of that decision has been validated annually for 62 years." In his eulogy on his father, who passed away at the age of 91, Dad was every bit as perceptive and lyrical. He wrote, "When a man lives for more than 90 years, surely he has been many men. No one here knew all of them, but we each knew several. A man's life is not seamless. There must be stitching beneath the fabrics, and beneath the surface are the ligatures, the connectors. Each human character has its own infrastructure. My father was not, I think, a complicated personality. You worked hard to earn your keep. You provided for your family. You served your community and you worshiped your God. You did these things, it seemed to him, because they were sensible and necessary and gave purpose to this life, however long it might run. He could always see the path before him. He liked observable data. He paid his taxes quarterly in advance and rejoiced in the rebates. The only extravagance he ever permitted himself was great expectations for his children. In this, as in so many other perplexities, he was comforted by a sense of humor. So my grandfather sent a note to my father when Dad was at Yale concerning cleaning and laundry bills that had been run up. I find it difficult to understand, wrote Julius Flink to his son. I thought whenever something was soiled, you threw it away and bought a new one. There can be no doubt that Dad's parents lived inside of him all through his life, and the power of their influence was permanent and far-reaching. The longer he lived, the more reverentially he spoke of his parents and their good deeds. He loved them very deeply and understood how fortunate he'd been to have been raised by such an incomparable couple. I'm sure they had a few minor imperfections, but to me and my sister, they were sacred. But looking at Dad's adulthood, no one was more important or influential than Joy. I lived with my father in London for the last 3 years of his 8-year stay there, from 1970 to 1973. Those may have been the 3 most important years of my life, because the time we spent together when I moved from the ages of 18 to 21 was so substantial and psychically rewarding to both of us. During that period, he was a ubiquitous bachelor, squiring beautiful and charming women all over town year after year, not really looking then for a long-term relationship after a painful divorce years earlier from my mother. Not long before he returned to work at Yale in 1973. When he was 49, I asked him if he thought he might marry again. I very much doubt it, he said, almost wistfully. I just don't see it happening again. And yet, this was before Joy happily swept into his life and altered it irrevocably. Their courtship was astonishingly swift. They met in October of '74, and they were married on May 24, 1975. You do the math. That adds up to essentially 7 months. I could tell almost instantly where they were headed. I clearly recall a weekend in December of '74, and Joy still had her apartment in New York and was working in the city. We'd both been visiting Dad in New Haven, shared a train ride together back to New York. Joy told me that some of her friends believed she was moving too quickly in her relationship with my father, and wanted to know my thoughts. I said, don't pay any attention to them. Some of them might even be jealous. She laughed heartily and seemed to appreciate my sentiments. Joy would refer playfully to herself as the wicked stepmother in notes she would write to me and my sister after they were married. In reality, she was exemplary in that role and never came between me and my father, never. Meanwhile, she was unswervingly devoted to my father as he was to her. They had a very good marriage, and she fit seamlessly into his life at Yale and beyond. In his Yale Alumni Magazine column, written in the spring of '75, Dad wrote, "Hearken thee now, I'm getting married. The lady is lovely in life, and her name is appropriately Joy. She began in a family named Reynolds. Her marriage, as they say so inelegantly on the society page, ended in divorce, as did mine. Our courtship was brief and resolve was early. Joy has already brought me 3 priceless gifts: her sense of humor, her sense of principle, and her outrageously perceptive and tolerant reading of my foibles, flaws, and fantasies. What is more, she has a ruthless forehand. One might say I've been rehearsing for this relationship all my life, but I suspect the gods would merely smile and say I was lucky. Joy is here." Well, Joy has affirmed for me recently that she feels lucky to have been married to my father for 47 years. The fact remains, there was someone else in his life who played an increasingly prominent role over the last decade or so. Excuse me 1 second. He'd be saying to you now, you should have brought the water up with you. My wife of 43 years is who I'm referring to here, Frances. The second Frances Flink, you might say, and she was incredibly attentive and devoted to his daily needs as he grew older. Across the last decade of his life, she was indispensable. He stopped driving by the end of 2018. His hearing deteriorated, his eyesight declined almost entirely, and no longer was he the same impossibly robust man he had once been, although he remains strikingly energetic, and his intellectual firepower did not decline at all. But he happily leaned on Frances and relied on her organizational skills. He'd dictate emails that she would write because he could barely see the screen anymore. At his direction, Frances would pay the bills, hire the nurses, take care of him in joy, and remove a large weight off of his shoulders with her unwavering dedication. The relationship between Frances and my father took on a new dimension. She stopped calling him Stanley at a certain point and would refer to him as Dad, which he embraced. In turn, he referred to her as the little lady. They intermingled beautifully. Till he was 95, Dad seemed almost indestructible, but the last few years, particularly 2022, were enormously trying for him and for us as a family. He took a couple of debilitating falls which resulted in a fractured vertebrae in his neck over the summer, and 4 months later a fractured hip. His determination to live a productive life was undiminished, but when, among other things, reading the New York Times became nearly impossible, he soberly examined where he was and did not like where it led. But even in his pessimism, he somehow retained his humor. Frances, Joy, and myself were in the room with him when my father left us on December 31st, exactly 3 weeks ago, and my sister called in over the phone and spoke to him as well. He'd been restless and very uncomfortable over the last few weeks he was among us. His medicines and the effects of COVID were messing with his mind and causing hallucinations. And so as the three of us sat with him at his bedside and watched him die, he seemed very much at peace. I believe he knew he had lived his life on his own terms and in his own unique way. He realized, I think, what the rest of us knew to be true for so long, that no one really resembled him. And I mean no one, in content or character. He saw no need to ever reinvent himself because he always knew precisely who he was and understood exactly what he wanted out of life. He balanced the scales between friendships and professional pursuits unassailably. Dad's old friend Janet Sussman, the accomplished British actress, wrote in a recent email, "Oh Steve, what a loss. Your amazing father and my lifelong friend. I'm immensely sad to think he's no longer gracing this wicked world with his presence, making the air around him more benign and thoughtful. But I also rejoice that he had such a rich and long life to spread his knowledge, good humor, and deep intelligence amongst those who loved him and those who were lucky enough to be his students. I treasure his memory as a wonderful person and a force for good." Janet was speaking for us all. It's been a sad day in many ways as we honor a great and good man, and for me, an authentically heroic individual. But I know this, he would want me to end this speech with some laughter, to let all of you remember him above all else with that distinctive smile and the wit and wisdom of his words. About 10 years ago, he sent me a small black and white photo from his Yale days in 1947 when he was dressed resplendently as always. He wrote underneath the photo, Jacket by J. Press. Shoes by Barry, Ltd. Smile from Frankie. Posture from Julius. Tie, Yale Co-op, $2.50. Try to emulate, love, Dad. I always tried to emulate him, but it wasn't easy. It was a tough act to follow. But I hope as he gazes down upon us now, that Dad realizes he is leaving behind a shining legacy, and he knows that those of us who lived in his universe will treasure what we shared with him for as long as we live. Thank you very much.